Good afternoon. We have breaking news right now coming into the KXLY4 newsroom. The jury in the Joseph Duncan sentencing has reached a verdict. Right now, the judge has just entered the courtroom in Boise, where the jury is expected to announce that verdict at any moment. We are on the phone right now with our photographer who is in the media room. Right now, we're being told that everyone is being seated. This happened very quickly this morning. Opening arguments began at about 8 o'clock our time, and they deliberated for less than 2 hours to determine if Duncan is eligible for the death penalty. We're told the foreperson of the jury is standing right now. We will bring you this verdict as it comes in. Just to remind you what this case is all about, this is the federal case involving Dylan and Shasta Groene, the kidnapping of both children and the murder of Dylan back in 2005. Again, this is a federal trial going on right now in Boise, Idaho. Yesterday, the jury saw the most graphic evidence that they have in this 2-week trial, videos that Duncan made of the children during his time with them in Montana. We want to remind you that even if they do decide right now that he is eligible for the death penalty, it's not over. They have another week that they would go through or so to hear statements from the victims and their families in this case, and then decide if he actually should get the death penalty. We're told they're about to read the verdict right now. I'm going to bring that to you right as they do. Joseph Duncan, of course, acting as his own attorney, gave a powerful closing argument this morning, telling the jury that they don't have any idea of how heinous his crimes really are, that he planned to rape and kill until he was killed, preferring death over capture, that he was on a rampage, and that he hated himself, and he hated the jury and society, and that he should actually thank the government for helping him get an eye for an eye. Right now, Joseph Duncan is being seated in the courtroom. Again, this is a sketch. Our cameras are not allowed in the courtroom or any kind of recording devices at all. That's why we're going to bring it to you this way this afternoon. Again, the jury started deliberating at about 10:15 local time this morning, so less than 2 hours to decide a number of factors. We're told right now, count one, kidnapping and death of a child. We're still working on that to find out what the verdict is on that decision. That's one of the aggravating factors that they have to decide if the government proved in order to decide if Duncan is eligible for the death penalty. They have several charges that they're going through here, so we expected this to take much longer. They have a lot of paperwork to fill out. You have to convince these people unanimously. We're told count one, yes, Duncan is eligible for the death penalty on that count, that is the intentional injury to a child. There are several more, again, that they're considering. I believe there's 10 in all. I'm not exactly positive on the number, but several of these aggravating factors. Did Duncan cause serious bodily injury? The jury says yes. That is another aggravating factor that makes him eligible for the death penalty in this case. Again, going through these charges one by one. This isn't guilt or innocence. Duncan already pleaded guilty to these federal charges several months ago. And again, this does not mean it's over. This means that this will move to phase 2, where the jury will have to hear again, not evidence that they've heard so far, but really testimony from the victims and their family members and anyone else who determines that Duncan should be put to death. Question 3, I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but the decision there is yes as well. So we're now on to our third factor, determining that Joseph Duncan is eligible for the death penalty in this case. So 3 out of 3 so far. Not unexpected, considering how quickly the jury deliberated in this case. You'd imagine if they disagreed, this would have taken much longer today or even possibly into this weekend. Did Duncan act with reckless disregard for human life? The jury in that question again says yes. Another aggravating factor that makes Duncan eligible for the death penalty in this case. 5 yeses so far total. And again, I'm not exactly positive on this, but I believe they may only have to prove one of those to determine if Duncan is eligible for the death penalty. Again, it seems like a lot of things that they have to go through, a lot of hoops that they have to jump through, but this is to protect anyone who doesn't deserve the death penalty from getting the death penalty. So this is why they're so careful in these cases. They're moving on to the statutory factors now, and whether or not Joseph Duncan is eligible for the death penalty on these charges. Again, Joseph Duncan never really put on a defense. He never called a single witness. Yesterday, he did try to call himself as a witness, but could not question himself. Therefore, the prosecution did not question him either. And then again, in his closing argument this morning, he spent his time telling the jurors, you have no idea how heinous my crimes really are, that I was on a rampage, that I intended to do something like a daycare invasion, he mentioned at one point, or parking lot hijackings. Again, what he ended up doing, as we all know, is going to Coeur d'Alene to a home in Wolf Lodge in May of 2005 and killing Brenda and Slade Groene and Mark McKenzie and kidnapping those 2 young children. The charge on the question whether or not he has committed similar crimes, of course, on that, the jury says yes. There's really no question on that charge. Yesterday, they called a witness who was Duncan's victim in 1980, someone that Duncan raped when he was 16 years old. Now they're asking, did Duncan commit offense in cruel, torture, or serious abuse? Again, that answer is yes. Once again, we go back to the videotape that was shown yesterday that essentially showed Duncan torturing Dylan in that cabin in Montana. All the answers yes so far, and again, not surprising considering how quickly the jury deliberated in this case. Was the crime premeditated? Again, the jury says yes. Again, not surprising considering all they had to look over, his blogs where he said before the murders that he was going to harm society as much as he could and then die. They also presented his GPS where they showed him going all around the West looking for victims. They ask now, was the victim vulnerable? Of course, on that charge, the jury says yes, referring specifically to Dylan Groene in that charge. Again, these are the federal charges involving the kidnapping of Shasta and Dylan and Dylan's murder back in 2005. Again, this case affected our entire community still. So many people have a reaction to this case. People from all over the country have been logging onto our website to read about this in the last few days. The next question, was the crime committed after previous offenses? Again, the jury says yes. Again, they can take into account those murders in Kootenai County that really preceded all of this, the murders of Brenda and Slade Groene and Mark McKenzie. They can also take into account a molestation charge that Duncan was accused of when he jumped his bail in Minnesota before coming to Coeur d'Alene to commit these crimes. And then also the crime when he was 16 years old in 1980 when he raped a young boy in Western Washington. Again, that's very important. That young man, who was a young man then, came on the stand yesterday. He's a naval officer. He picked out Duncan in the courtroom, and then he described everything that happened to him back in 1980. So the prosecution really pulling out all the stops on this case. A federal death penalty case has never taken place that we can find in the state of Idaho. And in fact, I have a list in front of me of all the prisoners on federal death row. There are 55 altogether. None are from the state of Washington or the state of Idaho. Right now, they're going on to just certification of this verdict. The judge certified that they did not discriminate against Duncan based on religion or his sex, so they move on from there. Again, a complicated series of questions these jurors were asked to decide. It was not guilt or innocence. It's not life or death. It's not that simple. They have to determine that the prosecution proved all of these charges. And then once again, this is not over. This means we go on to phase 2 of this sentencing, in which the victims are allowed to express why they believe Joseph Duncan should be put to death. All 12 jurors signed the certification. That means it was unanimous. That means they all agreed. And that means we do go on to phase 2 in this trial. Again, a lot of emotion in this area connected to this case, not only from everyone who watched this happen, not only from the surviving family members of these children and of the family that was killed in Coeur d'Alene, but also just the media that's been covering it, the court officers who were told are going to be required to have counseling because of what they've seen, a particularly graphic trial, all the testimony, and it has been very hard to listen to. And we're told today during Duncan's closing arguments, one of the jurors actually made eye contact with some people in the gallery and shook his head. They've cried off and on during this entire 2-week trial. They've wiped tears. They've covered their mouths in horror. They have been subjected to incredibly graphic video and graphic testimony and graphic evidence that has been presented. But obviously, the federal prosecutors here, knowing they have to give every bit of the evidence they have in order to ensure the death penalty, which is what they were going for in this case. We're not done covering this case at this point. We have much more coming throughout the day from Boise. We're trying to get reaction from the courtroom. Everyone in this case has been under a gag order since this all started from the federal judge telling people not to speak about the case if they're involved. We're assuming that the gag order will not be lifted until the second phase is over. So we would love to hear from the family members at this point. We may not, and we probably will not hear from the attorneys in this case either. Steve Groene was in court today during the closing arguments, and we're presuming is in court this afternoon to see this happen. But it looks like, once again, we are moving for the next phase in this case. The jury, in less than 2 hours, determining Joseph Duncan is eligible for the death penalty in this federal case. And we will move on to the next phase where the same jurors have to unanimously agree that Duncan should be put to death. We will bring you more coverage on this case throughout the day here on KXLY4 and all day on our website, KXLY.com.